Hello and welcome to The Rest is Football with me, Gary Lineker, and on this special episode, owing to the final that we've got coming up tomorrow, we have the Spanish football correspondent for The Guardian, host of the Spanish football podcast and friend of the pod, Sid Lowe. How are you, Sid?
All right, Gary, how are you? It's been a busy few days, hasn't it?
Sid, thanks for doing this. What's the feeling at the moment in Spain about how this team has performed so far?
Well, I mean, obviously, look, the starting point is a huge amount of excitement, a real admiration for how they've played, because it's not just that they're in the finalists, they've won every game without having to go through a penalty shootout. It's that they've had a run, and they've been talking actually about this idea of possibly winning a Euros by beating 4 world champions. Because, of course, they had Croatia, who, of course, weren't world champions, but they've had Italy, France and Germany and England next. But I also think the kind of the context of this is that no one really expected this. I think there was a belief within Spain and probably outside Spain as well that this was a side that could get to the quarterfinals, that if the draw was kind, could get to the semi-finals, but might not be quite good enough to reach a final. I think pre-tournament, when they talked about the favourites, and again, I suspect this isn't just inside Spain, I suspect this is true everywhere else, there was that idea that probably France and Germany and England were the kind of the top rung of teams, and then maybe Spain were in that next collection of teams alongside Portugal and perhaps one or two others. And Spain, in that sense, I think have not just pleased people, but I think they've surprised people. And one of the things that's happened as well is that there's been a kind of recalibration of the quality of Spanish players, because part of that analysis pre-tournament was about this idea that, well, how many players do we have in our team that are genuinely amongst the best 2 or 3 in the world in their position? And I think mostly they looked at Rodri and they said, well, he is, but maybe no one else is. I think possibly they overlooked Dani Carvajal just because he's a right back, and maybe you don't talk about right backs. And I think obviously what's happened in this tournament is the emergence of players like Fabian, who they knew was good, but goes under the radar a little bit. And in particular, of course, the two wide players.
We'll come to those shortly, but it was interesting, you see, they thought, they get to a quarter-final and if they get on the right side of the draw, but they very much got on the tough side of the draw, didn't they? They've beaten the host nation and then they've beaten France. I mean, 2 of the giants of world football.
Yeah, and having come through the group they came through as well. There's a group that I know, look, in the end, it's true that Italy, it turned out, weren't as good as we thought. And actually, maybe we should have foreseen that, because Italy's tournament record, despite the Euros, of not qualifying over the last 7 or 8 years, is actually pretty poor. And Croatia, I suppose, in a way, maybe they were a team that at some point time was going to catch up with them. Yeah. But it's still true that you looked at Spain's group and you thought, well, that's a group where potentially they may not even come through the group. Now, obviously, when the top 3 all go through, depending on how many points you collect, when the top 3 will go through, I don't think we should have ever doubted that Spain would get through it. But there was a doubt about whether they would win the group, which, of course, with hindsight, it might have been an easier draw had they not won the group. And so you've got this combination, as I say, of Croatia and Italy, followed by those 2 that you mentioned. Who knows, perhaps it's been good for Spain, although I don't think we've had the same approach from Germany as we had from France, and certainly not the same approach from Germany and France as we had from Croatia and Italy. But we've seen a Spanish side, I think, that demonstrated a versatility that maybe they haven't had in the past. And that's been a big part of the focus. Certainly in the first 3 or 4 games, maybe less so in the last couple, that idea of a Spain team that doesn't necessarily want possession for its own sake, that does want to be a bit more direct, that maybe isn't the Spain team of before. Now, you look at the last 2 World Cups and, it might be that I'm kind of looking back too far here, but it's very definitely been part of the discourse around Spain that you go to Russia and you have more than 1,000 passes and you lose to the Russians on penalties in the first knockout game. And then you go to Qatar and you have, I think it was over 1,000 passes attempted, not quite completed, but 950 or something completed. And you don't go through against the Moroccans. And there was a real sense post that World Cup of saying, right, we need to twist tiki-taka a little bit. We need to do things slightly different. Now, I'll be honest with you, I thought that part of the discourse around that, part of the way they talked about that, was actually done to kind of justify a change of manager rather than being a reality. And in the last 6 months or so, we saw a Spain team that I don't think were quite as different as they were saying they were. But once De La Fuente had decided, absolutely, we are going to play both of these wingers. We really are. We're not going to play one of them. We're going to do them both. And I think we really have seen that. The stats bear it out. I must confess, I haven't seen them post quarter-final. But I think going into the quarter-final, I think Spain were, in terms of possession stats at the Euros, I think the 11th team. And this is a team that we always imagined would be first, and first by a very long way.
It's not the only change, though, is it, Sid? Because even if you look at the team now, there's hardly any players from Barcelona and Real Madrid. In fact, against France, I think France had more players from those two teams than Spain did. That's a big shift.
Yeah, it is, and I think that links us back actually to what we were saying, that in part, when you sort of analyse, have we got the best players in the world? Your starting point from a Spanish perspective, whether you mean it to be or not, I think you almost can't help it, is to look at Madrid and Barcelona and say, well, they haven't got Spaniards, therefore Spaniards aren't the best in the world. Now, that got challenged a little bit, I think, in 2008 and 2010 because of the Spanish players playing in the Premier League. So you had Silva eventually. Obviously, it took a while for him to go. You had Cesc and you had Fernando Torres and you had Xabi Alonso and a couple of others who, off the top of my head, I can't remember now. But I do think that's true, that this is a team from a different place. Actually, funny enough, in the press conference on Thursday, Dani Vivian was asked about the fact that this World Cup is being watched and enjoyed. The TV figures show this. In the Basque Country, traditionally obviously a place with an independent kind of mindset where people haven't always followed the Spanish national team. And he said, well, there's 9 of us in the team. So of course they're watching us.
Tell me about Luis de la Fuente. We know he's been successful at youth level with Spain and now he's taken over the national side. What's his background? Where does he come from?
Well, I mean, his background, and he makes quite a lot of this, is a little town called Aro, which is near the Basque Country. But let's not get into the debate about what is the greater Basque Country. He played for Athletic Club. He was a fullback who stood out as being competitive and being, I think, quite intelligent rather than necessarily being an outstanding footballer. He wasn't one of those people that you necessarily looked at or listened to talk and thought, he's going to be a manager for sure. He's built his career, as you say, through the youth structure in the Spanish Federation, which is something actually that Spain have kind of quite liked before they did that with Julian Lopetegui, of course, who had relatively little experience at senior club level when he became Spain manager. Relatively little. De La Fuente has even less. And I think there was a significant doubt around him. It's very interesting, you think back to him taking over from Luis Enrique. And as I said, there was quite a lot of this attempt to say this will be different. He's going to twist this. We're going to be more direct. We're going to be more aggressive. And a bit of it felt a little bit like kind of protesting too much. But I think it started to happen. But even then, talking to Spanish colleagues here who covered the Spanish under-21s, who covered the Spanish under-19s, even when those teams were being successful, they would always say, that's because they've got good players. It's not about Luis de la Fuente. And there was a huge amount of doubt about whether what he'd done at youth level could be transposed onto the senior team, in part, of course, because of the nature of group dynamics. Kids are not the same as professionals. And I think actually what we've seen in this tournament is partly the success of a man who's managed to get that same group dynamics he had then into the team now. Now, it helps, of course, that a lot of these players have worked with him at under-19, under-21 level. A lot of these players feel a degree of, I don't know whether to call it gratitude or even debt to him, in terms of his help in their development. A couple of key decisions in terms of members of the squad, and the obvious one that became a real talking point in Spain is the departure of Sergio Ramos, and the fact that there was clearly a sense of friction there. And I think that was about group dynamics and about leadership as much as about football. And what he's really done is given those players a degree of freedom. I was very struck by something that Rodri said before the tournament. We had a day with the Spanish national team just before they left for Germany. And Rodri talked about De La Fuente understanding the difference between a national team and a club team. Understanding that there wasn't the time to impose a really clear and very structured system. And of course, we're talking about Rodri here, someone who's seen this with Guardiola at Manchester City, and saying that there's 3 or 4 very clear concepts that he made very clear. And beyond that, he didn't want to kind of confuse people with other things. He trusted in the players that he's got. He trusted in their capacity to kind of run the team within those broad parameters. And obviously, the evidence is showing that it's worked really well.
Certainly is. I mean, you mentioned Rodri there. I read your piece you did with him. I saw it in The Guardian. I mean, it was fascinating. What an articulate, intelligent footballer he is. And you can see that way he plays. I mean, he's been so important to Manchester City and he's so important to Spain. He doesn't lose very many football matches. What was he like during that interview? How did you feel he was as a person, as a human being, in terms of intelligence, etc.?
I'm fortunate enough in a way that it's taken a while for Rodri to be recognised, I think, as a big player. And without wanting to necessarily kind of blow the myth here, it is normally easier to get access to and talk to players who are not necessarily considered the superstars. So over the last few years, I've spoken to Rodri quite a few times, and he's always been brilliant to listen to. He's always understood the game and spoken about the game with a clarity and a sort of a very rational approach as well. And I remember doing the first time I interviewed with him was not long after he'd arrived at Manchester City, and he was talking about the difficulties of adapting and talking about his own background. And obviously the first time you meet a player, quite a lot of the focus is on, being a student, being brought up the way that he was brought up. And he talked then, and it's really stuck with me, about how when he was 11 or 12, he had a coach who pulled him to one side and sort of started to explain to him different ways of playing, and how he had been a kid. And I think this is probably true of most players who make it to the top, even those who end up being defenders or deep midfielders. Obviously as a kid, because he was the best, he was scoring all the goals. It was the kid who played up front, who was scoring all the goals. And there comes a moment when a coach says, I'd like you to play here a little bit deeper. And he talks about how it just kind of fell into place for him, that he understood the spaces. He understood how this movement creates that one. And that even from a very young age, there was I don't want to sound kind of overblown here, but a kind of a conceptual awareness of football that made him different to other players. I personally think that he's been a little bit unfortunate that Sergio Busquets was around, and that Sergio Busquets was around for too long.
He was the master, wasn't he?
It's kind of blocked his path to being this player that he is now. Now, obviously, he's also a product of playing with Guardiola, and he talks a lot about how Guardiola's moulded him and shaped him and kind of made him rethink things. But, the thing that most got me about Rodri, and this, I did put it in that piece, so it's not Rodri himself saying it, it was before the Germany game, and Gundogan was talking about Rodri. And maybe I'm allowing myself to kind of run away with a throwaway line. But Gundogan said, "Oh yeah, I remember in the first year that Rodri was at Manchester City, he used to stay behind every day after training, 35 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour." And of course, at this point, I'm sitting in the press room thinking he's about to say to practice this, to practice that, to practice.
We've heard this all before, yeah.
to talk. Like, actually, yeah, that's part of it, isn't it? It's about understanding it as much as doing it.
Absolutely. I mean, he's become very much, I know Morata's the captain, but he's become very much the leader, hasn't he? Actually, while I mentioned Morata, is he okay?
Yes, he is. He's fine. He's absolutely fine.
He is. It was a worrying moment. It was extraordinary.
Yeah, and Morata is, just very briefly to pick up on what you're saying there about the captain, I feel like the Spanish national team has a kind of a shared captaincy. Yeah. It may be that I'm trying to compartmentalise a little bit too much here, but I think you can look at three players in particular. And you can look at Dani Carvajal as the captain from the point of view of the experience, the aggression, the competitiveness. You look at Alvaro Morata, who's the captain from a kind of, if you like, an emotional and human point of view, in terms of he's the guy that makes everyone feel comfortable within the group, that brings everyone together. And then Rodri is the captain from a footballing perspective. And Rodri said something very interesting the other day, not actually to me, I wish he had said it to me. And he was asked about Lamine Yamal and Nico. And he said, I've had to tell him off a couple of times. And I think that tells you something about him as well.
For not doing the homework, probably.
Yeah, exactly.
Sid, I've resisted the urge to go too quickly, too soon with Lamine Yamal. I wanted to wait to the second half in particular. I mean, boy, oh boy. I mean, I've watched him all this season with Barcelona, aghast at times. But to do what he's doing in a major championship, particularly, I think, in the semi-final, was quite remarkable, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's as you say, you're sort of resisting the urge to go too soon with him. I think all of us are trying not to get too excited, because I think we all know that there's kind of a duty of care as well, isn't there, of not sort of loading him with all this pressure. But the trouble is, when you play that well, it's going to happen.
What can you do?
Exactly. There was a lovely line in I think it was before the first game, and Luis de la Fuente was asked about him, and in one breath he said, let's take this away from him, let's not put the pressure on him. And then in the very next breath he said, it's like he's been touched by God's magic wand. And you just thought, well, there you go then. He's been brilliant.
Having seen that clip of Messi with him when he was a tiny baby, maybe he has.
It's the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. It's the finger touching, and it's quite extraordinary. I mean, look,
Messiah has touched me. I should know. I know a Messiah when I see one. I've followed a few.
You have, indeed, you have. I mean, I suppose that's the other thing, isn't it? You obviously played against Maradona and really admired him, and I know how much you like Messi, and we're all trying not to do that. We're all trying not to put this on him, but he is very special. I guess the thing is, and I always feel this with young players, that sometimes the risk is that we judge them not just by what they are, but by what we think they will be. and we kind of project upon them a kind of a future them as well as a current them. But he has played phenomenally. He is unfortunately going to ruin this for us because, of course, every time we mention him, we can't help but mention that he's 16. On the day of the final, he will actually be 17, so it's been ruined.
17, yeah. He'll be an old timer then. He'll be past his prime, possibly.
Absolutely.
What's the reaction like to him in Spain, though? The general public.
There's a huge amount of enthusiasm. When he first got called into the Spain squad, there was certainly from the Madrid supporting half of the great footballing divide here back in Spain, there was a kind of a sense that this is a bit soon, isn't it? And is this because there's a bias towards the classic thing, a bias towards Barcelona? Because of course Gavi had been called into the squad where he barely played a first team game. Lamine Yamal, I think, had only had his first start something like a week before he went to the Spanish national team. He played quite a lot as a sub. But of course they'd seen him through the structure, and there was also a slight suspicion that maybe he gets called up now as a way of making sure you don't lose him later. Because, of course, he's got a Ghanaian mother and a Moroccan father, and there was the suggestion that he might play for Morocco, which, of course, Brahim Diaz has just decided to do. And I think there was a slight nervousness about whether this was the right decision at the right time. And now that's been blown out of the water. There's an enthusiasm for him, I think, A, because of his age, and B, because of his talent, but also the sense that him and Nico represent something different. They represent a stylistic difference, which is obviously that twist on tiki-taka, a bit more direct, willing to run at people. That's very exciting for people to watch as well, I think, and that helps people. There's a niceness about the way they talk. They're very fresh. They're very enthusiastic. They don't seem to have some of the complexes that footballers either have or develop later on. And who knows, maybe with time they will become a bit more guarded. And again, I'm a bit loath to go too far down this route because I don't want to load this pressure onto them either. But there's also the sense of these two symbolising a shift in society. The sons of immigrants in both cases. Kind of thing, Because bear in mind that processes and waves of immigration in Spain are at different stages than in the UK and then in France and in various other European countries. And so there is something about these two being groundbreaking as well.
The story you've got to tell of the Williams brothers, because it's quite remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, and so the Williams brothers, and what I love about this is there's a couple of different dimensions to it, but the kind of the starting point of this is that Iñaki and Nico's Williams' parents, Maria and Felix, crossed the Sahara barefooted, climbed into Spain at the North African enclaves that they've got, came into Bilbao. Iñaki's mum was pregnant with Iñaki when they arrived in Spain. He's born in Bilbao, which is what qualifies him to play for Athletic Club, because of course they have a Basque-only policy. They get taken in by a charity. They get looked after by a charity, a priest by the name of Iñaki, hence Iñaki's name. And the family kind of begins their story in Spain, in Pamplona. What happens with Iñaki and Nico, I think, is for me at least, is there's a tenderness to it that I really admire and really love the kind of the approach of these two brothers, which is that Felix, the father, goes to England, and he's in England for basically a decade. He's in England trying to find work. He works as a ticket collector at Stamford Bridge, amongst various other things.
Really? Wow.
And so Iñaki, who is 8 years older than Nico, effectively becomes kind of Nico's surrogate father. He takes him to school every day. He takes him his packed lunch. He picks him up afterwards. He takes him to football games. He looks after him as a father figure, and they end up playing together in the first team of the athletic team. Now, the national team thing I think is really interesting as well, because what happens is there's a moment in which Iñaki, after thinking that he would have the chance for Spain, doesn't get there. And his grandfather back in Ghana says, I would love to see my grandson play for Ghana. So Iñaki agrees to play for Ghana, having previously rejected it. And previously resisted it, and he felt that it didn't feel right to him. He said, "Look, I'm Spanish. I was born in the Basque Country. I feel Basque. I it's not quite right, and I feel like I'd be taking an opportunity from someone else." Now, that's the Iñaki story, and I didn't realise, I must admit, until this tournament, that there's a Nico element to that as well, which again feeds into this idea of Iñaki sacrificing himself and being a father for Nico. Nico tells the story that actually the way Iñaki had told his grandfather's story was not quite right. Because what the grandfather had said was, I would like one of my grandchildren to play for Ghana. And Iñaki effectively says, I'll do it so that you can play for Spain. and I love these two as a pair of brothers anyway, and as a pair of footballers. And I just thought, even that is a kind of a beautiful moment that says, here we are, this kind of dual identity family, but I'm doing it for you. Now you go and win the Euros.
That's a really beautiful story, isn't it? Do you worry about these young players? Because we saw what happened with Pedri, and he got injured again in this tournament, which was a shame. But he played a lot of football very young. Do you fear the same might happen to perhaps Lamine Yamal and Williams, or not?
I think everybody fears that. I think maybe in Nico's case, no, because he'll be 22 by the time the final comes around.
He's
his
a bit
birthday
older,
tomorrow, I think. Yeah, so he's a bit older. I think with Lamine, obviously, what happened with Pedri that is the thing that everyone grabs onto, and in particular Barcelona fans grab onto because they feel that the federation didn't manage him the right way. So that season he played, I think in a calendar year, I think I'd be right in saying he played 70, I can't remember how many it was, 74, 75 games. But he went to the Olympics as well as the Euros. And that was the real focal point, if you like, of the frustration. Now, coming into this tournament, Spain hadn't yet named their Olympic squad. And of course, Lamine is of an age where he could be in it. And he was.
That's why I ask, actually, because I saw a piece this morning that said he was. They thought he would be in the Olympic squad, and I thought, oh God, they're not going to do that again, are they?
No, exactly. And this was a focal point, and he said no, and he actually said, "Look, I would like to, but I thought about it. I thought about it rational, and I wouldn't forgive myself if something went wrong." And I think, I don't want to make a positive out of the fact that Pedri's had terrible injuries, but at least that was the warning, if you like, for other players.
Lesson learned.
Yeah, I think so. And obviously there's a broader question about the fixture list. And it was very interesting listening to Rodri say, 50, 60 games a season, maybe you can do that a couple of years, but you can't do it for 10 years. And that's why I'm worried about people like Lamine. And that's a broader question. It's not just about Lamine, but obviously he's, if you like, in that generational firing line that this could happen again. Yeah,
very much so. I want to talk about Dani Olmo because he's a player that didn't really start the tournament in the starting lineup, was he? Because Pedri was there and he stepped in. But I mean, he's a real talent, Olmo. I read this morning that his release clause has been made public, and I think he might attract a bit of attention.
Yeah, he might. His release clause is you know what, off the top of my head, I can't now remember if it's the 15th or the 16th of July, but basically before the 15th or 16th of July. And it's quite interesting talking to him because he now says, well, you all know my release clause without ever actually telling you what it is. He just assumes we all know because, of course, he knows that we all know. And basically his departure is on the way. Bayern Munich have been interested. Barcelona have been interested. I must confess, I don't know what his final decision will be. I do know that there was a slight difference of opinion within the family about where he should probably end up. His career is really interesting as well because it's been a very managed career. Leaving Barcelona early to go to Croatia because he was aware that
he's never played in Spain, has he?
Exactly. So Dinamo Zagreb were going to give him opportunities he wouldn't have got elsewhere. Going from there to Leipzig, because of course that whole idea of the Red Bull model where we develop young players and then we allow them to move on. And I think that has meant that he's gone a little bit under the radar in Spain because he's been a little bit outside of the country. I also think he's partly a victim of the fact that the Spanish structure hasn't really allowed for a number 10 until now, because it's tended to be 4-3-3. It's now more like 4-2-3-1, and he can be the one in the middle of the three behind the forward. I think that's helped him. I think he's also a player who maybe doesn't do things that are kind of fantastically attractive. He's not a fantasy player, if you see what I mean. He's technically brilliant. He takes really
His
good
goal
decisions.
Was in the semi.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, this is why for a moment there I was backing away from my own words because I think the goal he scored in the semi is so wonderful. But I do think there's a lovely Spanish phrase which is to enter into someone's eye. He's maybe not always been a footballer that enters into your eye. He's not the kind of naturally incredibly graceful or incredibly technically gifted, but I think he's very, very good at everything. And I think this has been a great tournament for him, not just because of how he's played, but I think because it has made people who maybe were doubtful about him think, actually, yeah, this is the guy. And coming into the tournament, I'll be honest with you, I thought if he was going to play, he would be one of the two wide men, kind of forced to come inside and be a combinations wide player rather than a run at you wide player. Or he might end up as the false nine. As it's turned out, the restructuring of that midfield has enabled him to be the 10. The restructuring and, of course, Pedri's injury has enabled him to be the number 10, which is where he feels happiest.
Do the Spanish public see themselves as favourites in this final, given the way that they've played?
Yes, they do. Of course they do, given the way they've played.
Yeah.
But without believing that this is done. Because, of course, there is an awareness of English football. There's quite a lot of Spanish people watch English football. There is awareness of the enormity of the names that they've got. I mean, Spaniards obviously have watched Bellingham all season. Now, it's true that Bellingham, since around about February time, hasn't been as good as he was in the first half of the season. But still, an extraordinary first season from him. And people look at Bellingham and go, well, he's brilliant. Harry Kane's brilliant. Phil Foden's brilliant. They saw him at the Bernabeu score that brilliant goal. And so there is an awareness that, look, this lot might not be playing that well, but they've got some footballers. And so I do think that, you can't not be favourites when you've had the run that Spain have had. But I think there is naturally a degree of caution, and that's about Spain, but it's also about England and a recognition of the quality of their players.
My final question, Sid. Who are you cheering on? I know you love your Spanish football.
Yeah, no, I am English. And this, it's true. And actually, this speaks to the Iñaki Williams thing we were talking about. It speaks to Laporte and Lenormand and so on. I think sometimes we get hung up on the idea that you can only have one identity. And you can have more than one identity, and you can have a connection to all sorts of countries. And if Spain were playing anyone except England, I would be wanting Spain to win. But they play England. And yet it's also true. This sounds incredibly, lacking in enthusiasm or passion or whatever. But when you're working at a game, it's not quite the same, to be honest.
Oh, it will be on Sunday. I think
yeah,
I'll be working.
To be honest, I
might disagree with you on that one.
When it happens,
You've still not said who you're cheering for.
Oh, England. I am English. I mean, there's just no avoiding that.
Just for clarity, Sid. Just for clarity. Thank you so much. It's been fascinating as always. Your insight is invaluable. Thank you. That's all we have time for on this episode of The Rest is Football. Do join us for our show tomorrow, where we'll have Micah and Al back previewing the European Championship final between England and Spain. And of course, the final tomorrow will be live on BBC One. We'll be on air from 6:30. Goodbye from me, and thank you once again, Sid.
Pleasure.